Our third speaker is Pamela Martin, and she will be speaking about every third mouthful. Go ahead, Pamela, please.
Oh, should that be full screen?
Yes, if you put it into presentation mode.
Oh. In presentation mode?
Or like full screen slideshow mode. There you go.
There you go.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, hello, I'm Pamela, the Martin half of, here we go. The Martin half of the art partnership Chatwin Martin. Peter Chatwin is the other half. So let's go. Is it possible you might like to come to the museum and look down the microscope at my genitalia? Asked Christopher O'Toole. Despite this somewhat prurient suggestion, Peter and I were not to be deterred. In the invitation of sex and intrigue, how could we say no? Chris then continued, there are over 25,000 bee species in the world, and the male genitalia of each species takes on a different form. It didn't matter that the initial emphasis of the invitation had changed. Our curiosity had already been pricked. Facts then began to roll out like an everting endophallus. Of all those bee species, only 12 are honeybees, 670 are bumblebees, and the rest, the vast 97% majority, are solitary bees. Super efficient at pollination. Affectionately, Chris calls these his solitary bees, his scruffy bees. They dive headlong into flowers, get pollen all over them, and therefore do a brilliant job at pollinating. And over the last decade, we have lost over 25% of our native bee species here in the UK. In other parts of Europe, it's over 47%, and similar losses are reported further afield. As a consequence, worldwide, our food supply is under threat. Thus began our art science research project with Chris in 2002, and it would eventually take us across 3 continents to work collaboratively in the field and in the laboratory with our 3 main protagonists, leading entomologists specializing in bees, and most importantly, their role in pollination. To Chris, we became his artistic baggage, and from the laboratory, we accompanied him in the field from the UK to southern Italy and eventually to the California Central Valley. Dr. Steve Buckman was based in the bee hotspot of southern Arizona among the heat and the cacti, and with Steve, we tracked him from the field back to the laboratory. And whilst on a 3-month international art fellowship at Beacon House University School of Art in Lahore, Pakistan, by a circuitous route, and at the very outskirts of the University of the Punjab, we discovered Dr. Nazreen Muzaffar, bee woman extraordinaire, and the hollow-stemmed nereid, in the search for which Peter was nearly kidnapped, which is another story for another day. Since our art science research project began, Peter and I have produced 3 touring exhibitions that have explored what we have learned during our collaborations. Every third mouthful, our whole art collection and our first exhibition goes under this title, an extract taken from Steve Buckman and Gary Nabhan's book of 1996, The Forgotten Pollinators. Every third mouthful of food we eat is dependent upon the unmanaged pollination services of bees. To adopt this as a credo meant to take on the responsibilities it implied, to provide a visual commentary on what we were to experience and learn by being with our scientist friends in the field and in the laboratory. With that in mind, in this first exhibition, we focused on the positive and negative aspects of the world in which we found ourselves. Super bee in the 6th mass extinction has super bee surrounded by its pollen-coloured cocoon, with its long red proboscis already probing into the void. Super bee seems vulnerable to its kryptonite-like counterpart, the 6th mass extinction, the dead soul draining away all life. Oh, I'm on to tarts already. Anyhow, the vibrant side of tarts is also staring its demise in the face. Flowers, as Chris tells us, are promiscuous temptresses. Steve likewise refers to them as perfumed courtesans. Uncle Monty, in the cult film With Nail and I, speaks of them more bluntly. He loves cauliflowers. Flowers are just tarts. They're like prostitutes for bees. In biological terms, who can argue? Flowers entice bees with their gloriously abundant voluptuousness. Our food supply and the preservation of biodiversity rely on this promiscuous relationship. Our second touring exhibition, Party On, is a collection of prints, all of which are blown up to outsized proportions, not only of Chris's genitalia. He gave us permission to bastardize his drawings, to be precise, and we wanted to celebrate these magnificent forms. These prints are 140 centimeters or 4'7" high, but also of Steve's microscopic enhancement of bees' heads. To investigate the secret world of insect detail with Steve, we were introduced to advanced microscopic multifocal technology, exposing us to a world of form, color, structure, texture, and pattern. To us, fascinating, beautiful, abstract visual effects. To the entomologist, this exposed world of detail was a means to precise identification. Surface sculpture, dimples within dimples, plus hair arrangements, all differentiating one species from another. We became curious about the curious. Like the function of spicules on an endophallus, we became hooked. The collection of prints that materialized from these collaborations, anthropomorphized admittedly, together with 60 crayon drawings of bees' heads on delicate crumpled tissue paper, serve to emphasize the vulnerability implicit in the fact that if we carry on partying on as we are, we're going to lose what we have. The strapline, let's celebrate biodiversity while we still can. Party on. To accompany the exhibition, we also ran bee mask making workshops for children. They would choose their favorite bee head and start drawing. Adults didn't want to be left out either. Our latest touring exhibition, Every Last Mouthful, is predominantly a 15,000 word, handwritten, hand-drawn, graffitied, illuminated manuscript. Excuse me. An enduring record of our exploits and with interactions. Excuse me. With not only the aforementioned entomologists, but also with a whole host of other ecological protagonists, activists, all hell-bent on finding solutions to our dwindling pollinators in the face of big business commercial interests and international political inertia. There is so much to celebrate, such good work being done by professionals, communities, and individuals alike. But when the UK's newly unelected Prime Minister practically rips out our commitment to COP26 before our very eyes, it is heart-wrenching to say the least, and says so much more about how much further we all have to travel. Many years on from that first enticing invitation of Chris's in 2002, politics really gets a grip on our work. We start to focus more specifically on rampant capitalism, government failure to act, and that particular bête noire of ours, neonicotinoids. Neonics and bees don't mix, needs must fix. I recently wrote some stroppy verse. In the UK, one of the commercial names for thiacloprid, which is considered a human carcinogen, is branded Calypso, conjuring up the image of a joyful dance, a dance of death more like. Dave Goldson, professor of biology at the University of Sussex, says, entire landscapes all over the world are now permeated with highly potent neurotoxins, undoubtedly contributing to the global collapse of biodiversity. Some of us have been pointing this out for years, but few governments have listened. Andrew Kimbrell, in his book, The Fatal Harvest, sums up the land as now containing a witch's brew of chemicals. Monsanto and Bayer Syngenta, just two of the world's agrochemical giants, heading the war on the destruction of bees and pollinators, defend their businesses against legitimate research. Scientists, publishers, journalists have allegedly been met with threats and harassment, and are, as I heard in a recent online discussion organised by PAN, Pesticide Action Network UK, chilled into silence by dirty tricks that go on in the dark shadows. Over the years, we have collected several stories that illuminate the advancement of profit over scientific values. One such is related here. Christopher O'Toole came out of the relatively safe realm of his study and into the capitalist world to put his theory into practice. The colony collapse disorder of the honeybee prompted Chris to persuade a commercial almond grower that rather than use imported honeybees as pollinators in the industrial food machine of the California Central Valley, its indigenous bee, Bob, the blue orchard bee, would make for a better job at pollinating, and more importantly to this big businessman, reduce costs. Chris had 80 acres of almond trees with which to prove his research. During his 4-year project, the abuse and threats he received from the aforementioned man were jaw-dropping. The attempted sabotage of his project, even more so. And it would be bad enough if the only threat was that of being locked up by the local sheriff. But on top of that, were Chris to try and undo a provocative act precipitated by the man himself, he was then threatened with being shot. The relationship had to end. Chris's project was a success he set out for it to be, and Mr. Bigwig knew it. Without prejudice, could it be said that allegedly Mr. Bigwig stole Chris's intellectual property? Who am I to say? I mean, right, but safe to say, it is all recorded without prejudice and masses of allegedlys, word for word in our manuscript. Redactions are an extra safeguard. Though between you and me, Peter and I only redacted with pencil, it could be rubbed out. Our manuscript is a labour of love and respect for bees and other pollinators, and a tribute to Steve and Nazreen and all those who continue to fight for biodiversity and the environmental cause. Food wars must not be an option. With it having been estimated that over 1 million people have seen our exhibitions, it is our privilege that we have been allowed to air in an alternative medium research that often ends up behind closed doors to circulate solely within the research community, and the attempted kidnappers. It is also a tribute to our dear friend Christopher O'Toole, who died last year in 2021, and to my beloved Peter, who died in 2018. After a 4-year hiatus, the manuscript is at last back on the table, ready for me to complete those last 4 pages that I promised him I'd finish, though in the intervening years there is so much more for me to write. And in Peter's and my own fashion, I promise to continue to celebrate, pester, prod, and provoke. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pamela. That was very, very interesting, amazing presentation. Thank you for sharing another perspective of bees. Unfortunately, we just have questions, perhaps for one more question. I see one question here. First, some comments. I love how beautiful, creative this project is, and I think that the world needs more interdisciplinary work like this. Have you gotten a good sense of how the public has received these works?
Yes, it has been. I mean, as I said, it's been sort of been seen by a lot of people, and excuse me. And we've exhibited at some quite prestigious places too, which is really great. Lots of positive comments within comments books. So it's difficult to be able to say, but I'm certainly hoping that we managed to touch people, and maybe because it was early on when we started in 2004, which was our first exhibition, it wasn't generally known too much about bees and the problems that we're actually having in a more general sense. So I'd like to think that Peter and I had some sort of input in maybe just starting the conversation. Who knows? I've no idea, but it would be nice to think that we had some input.
Thank you so much, Pamela. Definitely, it is touching us in another perspective. So we'll continue with our next